Shown in the figure below is a loop of wire that lies in a horizontal plane. You have a standard bar magnet that you will either move up or down and in the process insert and remove it from the loop. This problem concentrates on knowing which way the current flows in the loop, i.e. all answers are either clockwise or counterclockwise. This problem is in effect an application of Lenz's law. We can think of Lenz's law as a companion to Faraday's law. Let's remind ourselves what Faraday's law says. Faraday's law is expressed in two forms. One form is when we experience a voltage across a single loop, and the other form is when we experience that same voltage on a coil. In the case of the loop, the voltage that we experience is the time derivative of the magnetic flux. And in the case of a coil, since a coil is really a set of n loops in series, we get n times the voltage of any one loop. Faraday's law is mathematically complete and mathematically correct. The one difficulty, however, is the interpretation of the minus sign in Faraday's law. In order to decide upon the minus sign, we need to first make sure that the flux has the appropriate sign, and since the flux contains a dot product, we need to make sure that the area contains the appropriate sign, and there are simply many steps involved in getting the sign correct at the end of the day to decide whether the voltage in a single loop could be expressed as either clockwise or counterclockwise. Lenz's law allows us a shortcut by which we can get the direction of the voltage correct without going through the many steps to get a series of minus signs correct. And Lenz's law, simply stated, is oppose change. Mathematically, we can infer that the minus sign in Faraday's law is the opposition, and because Faraday's law has a time rate of change, the oppose change is effectively negative time derivative. And so what does Lenz's law say we oppose change in? Well, obviously it says we oppose change in magnetic flux. Now let's look more carefully for a moment at our loop. How can a loop conceivably oppose a change in a magnetic flux? Well, the answer is if a current should flow in this loop, the loop itself will create some contribution to the total magnetic field. And the loop will choose the direction of the current flow so as to make its contribution to the overall magnetic field in opposition to whatever external factors have influenced the loop. We understand that we apply the right-hand rule to learn the direction of magnetic field, and so curling the fingers of your right hand and placing those fingers upon the loop so that the fingers run clockwise, you're going to find that the thumb points into the screen. Therefore, we conclude that clockwise creates magnetic field into the screen. Similarly, we take our right hand, curl the fingers, and when we lay these fingers on top of the loop so that the fingers point in the counterclockwise direction, we note that the thumb is then oriented out of the screen. We now understand the two actions that the loop can take. The loop can either add magnetic field into the screen by creating a current clockwise, or the loop can add magnetic field out of the screen by running the current counterclockwise. Lenz's law teaches us that what the loop actually does is whatever is necessary to oppose the external change. So if the external change is to take away field lines, the loop will select a direction of current so as to put them back. If, on the other hand, the action of the external influence is to create new field lines, the loop will set up its field lines in the direction opposite to those that it just received. And in both of these ways, the loop will follow the principle of Lenz's law, which is oppose change. Just for the sake of simplicity in our graphics, we're not going to do these in the order they were given in the problem, but in that order that makes the graphical consideration the easiest. Consider for a moment the situation shown in the drawing. Here we have a loop on the right, and we have a bar magnet. Let's pretend for a moment that the bar magnet is very far away from the loop so that the loop is receiving no magnetic field. The concept behind this image is that the bar magnet is located very, very far behind your screen. So the phrase to insert the north end of this bar magnet means to bring the bar magnet from behind the screen until the front of the bar magnet is at the screen or even pointed right through the loop. In this part of the problem, we have inserted the north end of the bar magnet from behind the screen. Now, what we recognize about a bar magnet is that the magnetic field lines exit the north and they enter the south of the bar magnet. Therefore, by inserting the north end of the bar magnet from behind the screen, we have generated new field lines out of the screen. So, what shall our loop do? Upon the creation of new field lines, the loop will create its own field lines in the opposite direction. Since the new field lines are out of the screen, the loop's contribution will be into the screen, and therefore, in this instance, we get clockwise. Next, we're going to consider the process of removing the bar magnet. Now, what we know is that any circuit that has a loop that opposes the change has a time constant associated with that opposition. That time constant is the inductance of the loop divided by the resistance. If you wait a time period several times longer than L divided by R, the loop will give up its opposition to the former change and decide that the current situation is what one might call the new norm. So if we were to leave the bar magnet as shown in this situation, after 4 or 5 times L over R of the loop would decide that having that bar magnet inserted into its center is the good condition, it's the desirable condition, and that's what it wants to maintain. So the desirable condition to be maintained in this picture is that magnetic field lines are coming out of the screen towards you, because that's what the north end of the bar magnet does. However, we are to now make a change, and we're going to make a change by removing this bar magnet and putting it far back in the distance. When we have done so, we have then eliminated field lines out of the screen. To oppose this change, the loop will attempt to restore field lines out of the screen, and looking at our table, to restore field lines out of the screen requires counterclockwise. At this time, we're pretty much done playing with the north end of the magnet as inserted and removed from below. So let's move on to the south end of the magnet. Here we've turned around that same magnet so that the south end is closest to us, and we're going to begin in a situation which has been stable for a time much, much longer than L over R, in which the magnet itself is very far behind the screen and not influencing the loop to any significant extent. Therefore, the loop currently has 0 magnetic flux. And then what we're going to do is we're going to insert from below this same magnet, and that is the change. By inserting the south end of the magnet's contribution goes from nothing to a series of field lines directed into the screen, because into the screen is exactly what the south end of a magnet does. South end has magnetic field lines going into it. Therefore, having gone from nothing to lines into the screen, the opposition to change is to attempt to get back to nothing. And therefore, we will apply field lines out of the screen, and out of the screen is counterclockwise. Our final manipulation of this magnet in what can be called as from below or from behind the screen is to take this magnet and remove it. Once again, we assume that the magnet has been sitting in this location for a time period that is much, much longer than L over R, and as a result, the loop has become accustomed to and accepts the current situation as the norm, with the current situation being a magnet generating field lines into the screen. And with the loop being perfectly happy with field lines into the screen, what do we go and do? We go and take that magnet and push it far off into the distance so that it is no longer a source of field lines into the screen. This is the change, and the loop will oppose it. Since we have lost field lines into the screen, the loop will establish a current in whatever direction is necessary to put them back, and putting them back is to make new field lines into the screen, and that requires clockwise. The next portion of the problem requires that our actions be listed from above or from in front of the screen. And so for that reason, we're going to take our loop and we're going to move it far into the distance so that the loop is a small thing way in the background. We're then going to take our usual magnet and we're going to insert and remove an end into this same loop, which is now very far away, whereas the magnet is close to us. We are going to begin with the process of inserting the north end of the magnet from above. Therefore, the initial situation is that the magnet itself is very far from the loop, and the loop is happy with the status quo. What we will then do is insert from in front of the screen the north end of this magnet. We have therefore created a change, which is to introduce field lines that leave the north end of the magnet and are therefore directed into the screen. The introduction of field lines into the screen can be combated, and it shall be combated using field lines out of the screen, which is counterclockwise. If we wait for a little while, i.e. many times L over R, the loop will decide that the new situation is the current status quo, and that is having a north end of a magnet inside the loop supplying field lines into the screen is the desired condition. It is the status quo. It is the thing that should not change. And then, of course, we come along and we grab this magnet and we remove it. This means a loss of field lines directed into the screen, and the way we compensate for a loss of field lines into the screen as we put them back with new field lines directed into the screen. Finally, we have two more manipulations to consider in order to finish our discussion of Lenz's law. Both of these involve manipulating the south end of the magnet, and in the first part we are to insert the south end of the magnet from above, or i.e. from in front of the screen. So we begin with the magnet very far from the loop, meaning that the status quo that the loop will oppose change in is that there isn't any significant field in it. We then come along and take this magnet and we forcibly insert the south end of the magnet into the loop. The result is that we have just introduced magnetic field lines that, since they enter the south end of our bar magnet, are coming out of the screen. By giving new lines out of the screen, we can create opposition to this by placing new lines into the screen, and that would be clockwise. Finally, our last consideration is to remove the south end of the magnet from above or from in front of the screen. The assumption is that we have taken the situation shown in the figure in which the south end of the magnet is located inside the loop and left it static for a time period greater than L over R, so that the loop is now satisfied that the status quo involves the south end of a magnet located inside the loop, meaning field lines entering the south coming out of the screen. And then what we do is we remove those field lines that are coming out of the screen. The action of the loop is to restore the field lines coming out of the screen, and a restoration of field lines coming out of the screen requires counterclockwise for the direction of the current flow. And that completes our discussion of Lenz's law.